Welcome to Bart and Tart Talk About Art.
Bling, 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 bling.
So, hello, Simao.
Hello, Mr. Eric.
How are you today?
I am very, very wonderful as usual.
Always wonderful.
And today, as always, we are going to analyze a very special picture. This
Right.
one made by the greatest Salvador, Dali, the Spanish surrealist painter.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually, the name of this picture is, let me find the name.
I think it's named for a chapter in Alice in Wonderland, isn't that right?
I think so. It's called The Rabbit Sends in a Little Bill.
Yes. So the background to this is that this is part of a series of illustrations that Dalí did for a special limited edition signed illustrated version of Alice in Wonderland. And you picked
Right.
this one, Simao.
Yeah, I picked one of the illustrations.
One of the illustrations, the rabbit
Yeah.
sends in a little bill.
That's right.
So tell us about this picture. What made you pick this?
So first of all, last week we talked about medieval illustrations, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and they were also a bit surreal and a bit weird, because medieval illustrations have that surreal vibe to the eyes of the contemporary, the modern men and the
Right.
women and everyone in between.
Right.
These are also literally very surreal, psychedelic illustrations. And what I find interesting is that Dalí usually has this very slick, almost kitsch style, very very detailed, sometimes this almost photographic surrealism, right?
Yes.
I'm thinking of, I don't know, his wife as a Pietà, as a Virgin Mary. That's extremely kitsch. There is this one of a cross with a Christ floating in
Right.
the air.
That was some of his
They're
later
super-
stuff, wasn't it?
Sorry?
That was some of his later work, his religious work, I think.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. But even the famous, the clocks melting and all of that.
Absolutely.
It's so I have this expression that that is like being licked by a cow,
Right.
and these paintings have that thing of like being too polished.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are too polished, and these illustrations are not. They are pretty raw.
Right.
I think probably originally it seems that they were done in gouache and Indian ink or some kind of paint, or like aquarelle or something like that. And then of course they were reproduced using a kind of a photographic gravure technique called heliogravure. Heliogravure that I actually don't know exactly how that works.
No.
So I can't talk much about it, but I think all the illustrations look pretty powerful, pretty strong.
Right.
And the reason why I chose this one, it's because, I don't know, have you ever read Alice in Wonderland?
I have, but to be honest, I am not sure what this illustration is referring to.
I think this one. I mean, me neither. Because that's the thing. All the illustrations are super. Alice in Wonderland is like, it's the origins of surrealism. I would say it's one of the books that everyone that is into psychedelic art and surrealistic stories refers to as one of the first surrealistic stories, proto-surrealist story, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
So, everything in Alice in Wonderland is kind of crazy. But his illustrations are even more crazy because you don't necessarily see exactly to which moment they are referring, but they have some elements of the story. So I think in this particular picture, we see a house, a big house, and then we see a big arm coming out of a window.
Right.
So I think it's probably referring to the moment in which Alice drinks some kind of potion and starts growing and growing and growing, and then her limbs come out of the house.
Right.
Do you remember that moment in the story?
Vaguely. It's been so long
Vaguely.
since I... Yeah.
Exactly. But at the same time, it has elements of the rest of the story. There's like a caterpillar in the center of the picture that could be a reference to the caterpillar, to the hookah smoking caterpillar, right? And there's a little tiny girl with an arching arms in the left. I'm really bad at
lower right corner, right?
Yeah, that is above the signature of Dali. And that picture, that little figure, it's borrowed from one of his iconic paintings called "Girl Skipping on a Rope" or something like that. Let me see if I find. I'll probably not find the original, the painting that I wanted to know the name. But anyway, that's that picture. It's like he borrowed that character from one of his paintings.
Right.
And then he uses that character throughout all these illustrations. He uses this figure throughout all of these illustrations. So I think it becomes Alice. It becomes the Alice in Wonderland. So I find that interesting. So all these illustrations are a mix between Dali's world and Alice in Wonderland, because it's him basically using his distinct motifs. Like and in another illustration there is a clock melting in a tree,
right? And
there's others have the classic infinite landscape and all of that.
Right. It's very sort of emphatically Salvador Dali's Alice in Wonderland, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also, what I like about this picture is that the house looks like a Spanish house, for me, at least.
Yeah.
So it's funny to imagine, Alice in Wonderland, but as a Spanish girl.
Right.
As a Spanish Alice. And then there's a lot of elements that are just cute and pretty, like all these butterflies flying around. That I don't know why, I don't know what they are supposed to represent, but they're very pretty. There is another picture that looks like a seahorse and a woman, maybe it's a mermaid. Next to in the like she's cut by the frame of the picture.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there was a mermaid in Alice in Wonderland. I don't remember that. So else I think it's lovely image.
Right.
Yeah, and let me see. What else did I write about it? Oh yeah, that he's nowadays we think of there were many surrealist painters, but we think of Salvador Dali as, when we think of surrealist painter, we always think about Salvador Dali, even though he was expelled by the group. I don't know if you know that story.
It sounds familiar, but by all means, tell me all about it.
No, because he had officially it's in the group because the surrealist movement. It was it had communist. It was a communist anarchic. It had communistic and anarchic sympathies.
Right.
politically speaking. And when Franco came to power, Dali didn't speak against him or didn't publicly claim that he was against it or something along those lines. And so officially he was expelled from the group because of that. But rumors go that he was expelled because, he was too much of a character compared to the leader of the group, André Breton, so they would clash.
Right.
Their personalities would clash. And I think what makes and I understand why they clashed, because as they're both very they seem very very eccentric characters, both of them. But I think the majority of the population now doesn't even know the name of André Breton. I think only people that study art history know.
Right.
But the general population has probably seen something of Dali. And I think this kind of book is the reason, because Dali was stylistically very versatile.
Right.
He would do, more polished paintings. He would do this kind of illustrations. He would do jewelry. He would do a bit of sculpting. He even collaborated with Walt Disney. I don't know if you've watched the short movie that was produced by Disney together with Salvador Dali. Have you?
I think I have, yeah.
You have, yeah. So he became very pop. He was not afraid of being a sellout.
No.
Very commercial and all of that, and repeating and using his signature elements to sell everything.
Right.
So
yeah,
I like that about him.
Yeah. But that's the thing that's sort of very, and I'm actually dying to sort of read. Like, I think he would make a great subject for like a comics autobiography or something like that, because I think you're completely right that if you say surrealism or surrealist painting to sort of an average human being in the West, the first image that will come to mind for them, if any, is a painting, some sort of painting by Salvador Dalí, some melting clock, something like that.
I think so.
And I think part of that is, I think his paintings have, and part of what you don't like about his most famous paintings is probably a part of the reason why he's so well known, like this sort of very polished, very detailed look it has to it. A lot of people like that, for a lot of people that says sort of high production value, that says he really tried hard, that kind of thing, right? But I think part of it is also just that he was just a huge sort of icon of his time, just sort of a media figure, kind of like an Andy Warhol type figure almost.
Yes,
in that,
definitely.
His persona was as big a selling point almost in the end as his actual work. I think a lot of the work he's remembered most for, he did fairly early on. Like way before this stuff, and at this point, I think he was mostly known for being, or even more known for being Dalí than he was for his actual work, right? So he was kind of like a fine arts Paris Hilton almost at this point. That's a terrible thing to say, but some of that same sort of media fame, right, surrounded him.
Yeah. But I think actually that's an interesting point, because Paris Hilton or Kim Kardashian or whatever, they are known for being known and for doing whatever they do. As he was, he would say outrageous things and behave in very weird ways. But his work actually is very good. As an artist,
I agree. Yeah.
He's very good.
Yeah,
and he has that kind of work that's more kitsch. Work that appeals to some people, and then he has other work that appeals to other kinds of people. So I find that that's super cool. And you were saying that at this point in the 60s, he was already this kind of superstar, and this was made in 69. So it's the height of the hippie movement, right? This is when there was the Manson massacre. Right, Charles Manson massacre, that he killed Sharon Tate and all of that.
Yeah.
So that's considered usually the end of the hippie movement. And it's interesting that, you know, in the 60s, in the height of the hippie movement, they invite Dalí to make this painting, this book that looks super psychedelic, because the hippies clearly, and the psychedelic movement was clearly inspired by him. So if artistically he had become irrelevant, if he was just a pop star, they would rather maybe invite him for an interview or make a reality show or some other kind of thing, instead of asking him to create art.
Right.
I would say.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying he had become irrelevant. I think this work speaks for itself. This is somebody who's very, and like you say, it's very different from what he's famous for, and still very very cool and accomplished and everything else. So it just is an interesting aspect of Dalí's life, that he, you know, he's maybe, probably not, right? I'm just pulling stuff out of my you know, behind right now, but it feels to me like he's one of the first sort of fine artists who really managed to sort of leverage this new kind of sort of media hype that suddenly, you know, it was possible to have at this point, you know, with TV coming into prominence, and just like the amount of mass media and its reach in the general populace just generated icons and stars of a kind that you hadn't had in exactly the same way before, I think.
Yeah.
In terms of visual recognition, and in terms of, it's just this sort of the iconization or iconification, or what you would say. And I think he was one of the first artists that sort of really leveraged that, and that was kind of what I was trying to get at, is part of it. What's interesting about him is that you can kind of, even in this piece, you can see that he's consciously doing it by incorporating imagery that he is associated with. So he's sort of branding himself in this.
Yeah.
At the same time as it's a very good illustration, it's also very sort of, you know, trademark Dalí, right?
Exactly.
And one thing that, I mean, I was wondering about one thing in this picture that I think is very interesting. Is this sort of a cone shape in the middle of it, which kind of looks like stairs, but that leads up into the chimney. And I think that's a really sort of interesting sort of spatial play, as a certain person would have said. It's very sort of, it confuses the eye in an interesting way. I don't know if you have any ideas about what he's doing there.
No, I don't know either. But he was before he was a surrealist, he was inspired by the Cubist movement.
Right.
You know, he had some Cubistic paintings in the beginning, and I think this is a reminiscence.
Remnant,
that the right
maybe.
word?
Yeah.
Yeah, of the Cubistic movement. I think it's a stair going into the house, or going into the sky, or you know, I think it's something very surreal. And but that's the thing, because, you know, Cubism, it's more about the form, right? It's about breaking the space and all of that. And I think this stair kind of has, for me, it's almost like a spiritual ascendance, right? Because you have the little caterpillar turning into a butterfly, if you interpret that way, through the stairs, right? It's walking through the stairs,
right?
And there's like a sky, and in the blue there is a little butterfly, a little yellow butterfly flying.
Yeah.
So you can interpret it as a spiritual ascendance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which is kind of, you know, the Alice in Wonderland adventures can be interpreted like that. You know, somebody growing up spiritually, or, you know, becoming more knowledgeable, you know, just growing up, maturing. So maybe that's what he's doing.
Yeah, I think that's a convincing analysis, to be sure. That makes a lot of sense. Another thing I was curious to talk to you about, because you mentioned this, now that we're on the topic of Dalí, not this picture exactly, but you mentioned it looks as if it's been licked like a cow.
Not this
quality.
one though.
Not this one, no, but that quality of some of his the paintings he's most known for, the very sort of rendered, painstakingly rendered. Everything almost looks like it's made out of plastic, right?
Yeah.
And that I think that an interesting aspect of surrealism, I think, is that a lot of the surrealist painters are so concerned with delineating form convincingly, right? So Magritte does this as well. I think not as polished, but it's fairly realistic, right?
I think Magritte is super polished as well.
Yeah. And the Chirico
not as kitsch,
no,
but
not as
polished.
kitsch, but definitely sort of very and I guess the idea there is that for an image to be sort of truly sort of trippy, it has to be, I think they were trying, what I'm trying to say, I think, is that they were trying to combine something that is realistic, that is recognizable as being like, this is a dude with a bowler hat. Then putting that dude with the bowler hat, like this is a Magritte reference, obviously, putting that dude in a weird situation. So it's raining dudes with bowler hats, for instance, right? So combining the instantly recognizable, the sort of visually convincing realism with something that's really trippy and off and weird. And I do think there's a point to that, right? I think you get a different effect that way than if you go super loose with it. But
like this one is
like this one. I think this is, for me, this doesn't read as surrealism in quite the same way as something like Magritte or classic Dali. That's not to say that this is not good. I just think it just sort of becomes something a little bit different. This feels more like visual poetry than it feels like a dream, a visualized dream, essentially, which is what the surrealists were trying to do, right? Or they were trying to sort of speak in dream language, essentially, and that's not quite what this feels like to me. At least my dreams aren't like this, So it feels like he's doing something quite different from surrealism, to me at least, which does not make it any less interesting at all.
But that's what he said. I think at some interviewer asked him he said himself what was the difference between him and the surrealists, right? Because he stopped being part of the movement, and he said the difference between me and the surrealists is that I am surrealist. He's the movement.
So whatever he does is surrealism.
Exactly.
Well, okay.
Whatever he does is surreal.
Yeah.
And also, I think what you are talking about, that kind of surrealism, that's a branch of surrealism, actually. Not originally. Surrealism was not like that. Originally, surrealism was way more spontaneous. It had to do with, automatic writing and... cadavre esquisse. Do you know what cadavre esquisse is?
It's sort of a collaborative image making exercise, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like creating images or texts collaboratively. And when you start, you have no clue how it's going to end, and it's very, the process makes it very surreal. Right. Obviously.
You're sort of trying to access the subconscious through free association, essentially.
Free association, exactly. That's the expression, because those ideas were borrowed from Freud, who was the one that invented the idea of free association, right? That's when you put a patient in, the little reclined chair.
The divan,
yeah, and the patient just starts talking, whatever, and then through that random talk, then you start picking elements, and you start making sense out of it, right?
Right.
So surrealism was
when a therapist says, like, if I say this word, what do you think? you know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So originally, surrealism was more inspired by that. It was more automatic, more spontaneous, and I think the works of André Breton and I think André Masson as well. But
Hmm.
I can I cannot picture in my head any André Masson painting or anything, but I have this vague idea that his work was way more spontaneous. I cannot
Yeah.
picture any André Breton either,
I don't think I know
but
him at all. Masson, what you say?
what I can remember other surrealist stuff going in my mind is that there are paintings that are way more spontaneous and more abstract as well,
Mm.
which later surrealism didn't become so much. It abandoned that abstract
Right.
aspect in what it comes to ways of representation, and it became more abstract in the meaning, in
Right.
the content, not so much in what it was yeah, and on in how they were representing things.
Right. I
So
get.
that's a branch of it, yeah.
That was
And
probably it was
also,
probably easier to sell the more representational stuff, I would imagine.
yeah, exactly, because there's a reason for it to be kitsch. The people like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's a reason for kitsch to be popular.
It's
People
always sort
like
of
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's always sort of surrealism has always struck me as one of the most sort of in scare quotes, commercial of the isms, like the,
Yeah,
or should I say, sellable, probably. And I think that's because as much of it is, as they had these ideals about sort of confronting the mores of society and letting loose the id and that kind of thing, essentially it is about, it is an introspective kind of exercise. It's at least it became that rather than sort of revolution, change society kind of thing. It is more about sort of diving into your dreams and what do they say about you, and or at least I think it sort of interfaced with people who had these interests. Yeah.
yeah. It became, and I think that's why it was so popular
Mm.
in the '60s, because the hippie movement was all about that, right? At least
Yeah.
how I see it is like a revolution, but it's basically an individual revolution.
Yeah.
Change yourself to change the world, and in the end, you keep trying to change yourself the
Free,
whole time, and you don't change anything.
yeah. Free
You're
your
just
mind and
enjoying
all that.
yourself.
Free
Yeah,
your mind, and the rest will follow.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and also I think there was, and I'm not an expert on this in any way, but I'm pretty sure sort of the 50s and 60s saw a huge rise in sort of the popularity of psychoanalysis and um,
Especially in the States.
yeah, especially in the U.S. Yeah, and Dalí did live in the U.S. I think
He did, yeah.
for
That's also why I think that's also partially why he became so popular. Because at
mm,
that time, to be to be become famous and to become a good a known painter, you always need to sell, right? And back then, as kind of as now, the center of the art business is in the States, and it's in London. So he went to the States, and he became, I think, if you sell more, you become also well known, but also you sell more because you are well known. It goes together.
exactly, and I think the States back then, in terms of these all the new media that are not new anymore, but in terms of sort of this new mass media society that was that came about in the U.S. before it did in Europe. So I think this turning people who are good at whatever into icons and into media stars. I think that happened there more than anywhere at
Yeah,
that point, probably. So that's
yeah.
also that could also be a reason to go to the States. Yeah.
And also, you were saying about that his work is very commercial, and that surrealism is probably one of the most commercial movements. And I was
Hmm.
thinking it's so commercial that most of the video clips nowadays are essentially surrealistic.
Yeah.
I was thinking, for example, of the Cardi B's hit WAP,
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically a surrealistic film,
Right.
isn't it?
Yeah, I
Like
guess
women
so.
in a house,
I didn't see
in a
it, to
very
be honest.
weird house, and crazy things are happening in
Mm-hmm.
each room and all of that. It's like a dream as well,
Right.
right?
Crazy things
So
involving WAPs.
yeah, exactly, and sexual and very erotic because Dali's work also has that element a
Mm-hmm.
lot of times, and
Right.
surrealism was also worried about the eroticism and all of that. So
Mm-hmm.
that fits together. And you were mentioning that he was one of the first to capitalize on the idea, not on the idea, but on this on fame and on becoming an icon, but to the press and to
Right.
the TV and whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was one of the first and one of the last as well,
Yeah, that might be
because
true.
it was a generation. It was like Picasso, Andy Warhol, Dali, and probably that's it.
Yeah.
Not so not so many more that would make newspaper headlines.
Right. And I think it's
Uh,
that's a different discussion that maybe it makes more sense to have that discussion in relation to another image, but there is a discussion to be had about, was that because fine arts sort of turned inward and sort of became more conceptual and became more art for art's sake, etc., or was that simply a result of the general public becoming absorbed by other things than fine art, like sort of fine arts losing its privileged position in terms of providing people with sort of visual input they couldn't get elsewhere? Did it sort of become supplanted to some extent by TV and movies and mass printed magazines, whatever it might have been,
yeah.
the same way same thing that has happened to a ton of like classical music, has it still exists, but it's certainly to a large degree been supplanted. And you could say, like, if we continue the analogy with classical music, some of the directors, the conductors rather, of the sort of the mid 1900s, like Herbert von Karajan and Daniel Barenboim, and there were these sort of conductors who were also stars, and the
Hmm.
media would report on their, on their personal life to some extent as well. And that just doesn't really happen to classical music conductors in the same way anymore, right? Certainly people who are specifically interested in classical music will know of some, and there will be some that are stars in that field, but it's not going to be reported in the newspaper that some classical music conductor landed and will perform and etc. So it's not the same thing anymore, right? And I do wonder to what degree fine arts sort of turned its back to the general public, and to what degree the general public turned its back to fine arts, if you will.
Yeah, I think that we can only speculate, because
Mm,
I think there's probably so many reasons. I mean,
right.
first of all, I'm skeptical how much people would go to museums when Dali and Picasso were alive. How
Yeah.
many people would
No.
actually see
Right.
their work.
Right. Right.
But they would probably read the newspapers,
Yeah.
because what was there to read? Newspapers, and there was TV to announce things. So
Mm-hmm.
Dali and Andy Warhol at least, and Picasso, yeah, as well. They would make they would go to talk shows, and
Right.
there were TV series made about them and documentaries and all of that. So the population would be forced kind of to see them
Right.
anyway.
But I
And
think. Mm,
now people are no longer now people have so much there are other media to consume, and also even those traditional medias, they lost, I think they lost interest, but you can say that about so many other things like rock and roll. We're no longer in the age of rock and roll.
No.
Who are the new rock and roll stars? Nobody cares anymore.
Right. It's true.
So,
but I think
that's how it works.
I think you absolutely have a point, or I would imagine that I would agree with you that probably not. It wasn't that a ton of people actually went to see the paintings of Dalí back then. It was more that there was a sense that fine arts mattered, and the masters of fine arts mattered, and it was sort of important to be somehow informed about that field. There was a cultural capital, to use a sociology term, associated with it, and that sort of I think made people feel like they should be interested and they should keep up, and I think that sort of vanished a little bit to a large, as in certain circles. Certainly, it's still there very much, but in the general public.
It stopped being mainstream.
Yeah, it stopped being a thing where, if I'm gonna be seen as a somewhat sophisticated person, I need to know what Dalí is up to. I think that's not the case anymore, right? Now it's enough to have watched some good show on Netflix that you can talk to people about, right? That'll do now, I think.
I'm not sure because that's the thing with the new media. It's everything. It's our new media. It's super postmodern in the sense that is completely deconstructed and shattered and all of that. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to follow what the masses are actually consuming, because it seems like everybody is consuming something different. But for example, we both know John Ken Mortensen, right? That's his name, right?
Right. Yeah.
And on Instagram, he's followed by millions of people.
Right.
Millions.
Yeah. I mean, there's need. I think what I'm talking about is, average Joe. Let's say Denmark. Just let's narrow it down a little bit. Sort of the average middle class dude or woman. Like, they have guests over for dinner. And what do they feel like they should be informed about to not embarrass themselves in the conversation, right? And I think if you go back like 50, 60 years, fine arts might have to some degree been a part of that. And I think now it's not anymore. Of course, you can be specifically interested in that, and maybe you have other friends that are also interested, and then you have that conversation. But if you just have people over and maybe you don't know them that well, being able to recommend a good show on Netflix or whatever, I think that's probably right now sort of the bar for seeming as if you're not completely an idiot about pop culture and culture in general. It
stopped being mainstream.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's just, you said that a while back, and I think that's just what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Now you talk about the Cardi B video clip, which is surrealistic, instead of talking about the last surrealistic artist, for example.
I think that's right.
I think that makes sense. On another note, on the illustration itself, because I was saying that it inspired, that artists nowadays are super inspired by it. And it reminds me a lot of Ralph Steadman. I think that's the name.
Yeah.
Do you know who I'm talking about?
I know who you're talking about. The guy who illustrated Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, among other things, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And I would never think that the two would be connected. But the way he uses, color in these illustrations, and the way he uses black, it reminds me a lot of that.
The ink, definitely, and the wild splatter of ink, and the sort of the washed out color. I hadn't put my finger on that myself before, but absolutely, I see that, to be sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, both the movie and I guess probably the book, which I didn't read, but I guess they're both very surrealistic. So it makes sense that somebody that is a heir of the surreal movement was invited to do that.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if Ralph Steadman was an admirer of Dalí. That would make a lot of sense.
And
all right.
Also something that we didn't touch at all is that there I think there used to be this kind of stigma of fine artists touching mainstream mediums like illustration.
Right, to be sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And we mentioned that Dalí was not afraid of being mainstream, but I think it was with artists like Dalí that we started appreciating more illustration as a high art form instead of just something like a bastard of fine arts.
Yeah, and instead of but instead of a question of sort of craftsmanship, right?
Exactly. And I think, and you said that now fine arts don't have as much room in people's life as it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, on the other hand, I think now illustration has more room than before. I think people now pay more attention to that. I hope. Probably. I think maybe people don't know names.
No, probably not.
Well, but I think people, when they see an illustration, I think they're able to see, oh, that's very beautiful picture, that's art, and they would not say just a dumb drawing. And I think we owe that a little bit to artists like Dalí.
Yeah. I think that's probably a good note to end on, isn't it?
Yes, I think so too.
All right. Thank you, Smile.
Thank you, Eric. See you next week.
See you.